Hello everyone, my name is Jack Fisher and welcome to my world. And like any world that values truth, peace, and justice, forgiveness is very important. Revenge may be more appealing on some levels, it's certainly a better premise for action movies, cop shows, and superhero comics, but it's also easy to get lost in. Revenge is fueled by hate, and it's easy to hate, especially when you've been legitimately wronged. Forgiveness, that's a lot harder. It takes strength, will, agency, and an ability to temper your most hot-headed impulses. Not everyone can pull it off. Some aren't even given a choice. But when it happens, it's powerful. There's a reason why an entire religion was built around it, relatively speaking. But as difficult as it can be in the real world, it's even harder to tell a good, compelling story about forgiveness. Again, revenge stories are easier. They're fun, action-packed, and satisfying on a very primal level. Forgiveness stories are harder in that they require more complexity and introspection. That's challenging in any medium. It's also very easy to mess up. A story that culminates with one character forgiving another can feel empty and anticlimactic. Last of Us Part 2. Excuse me. But make no mistake, good, compelling stories can be told about forgiveness. And it need not appeal to one particular major religion. To show how, I like to single out two stories from two great franchises. Sam Raimi's original Spider-Man trilogy, specifically Spider-Man 3, and Avatar: The Last Airbender, specifically Season 3. Both stories are similar in that they center around a classic hero's journey. Both stories also have elements in which forgiveness plays a critical role in the plot. However, I would argue that only one does it really well, while the other is just incomplete at best. Spider-Man 3 may be the red-headed stepchild of the original Sam Raimi trilogy, but it's not an overall bad movie. It has a lot going for it, and it does a great job of continuing Spider-Man's journey up to that point. However, one of the biggest missteps in that journey involves a subpar forgiveness story. Now, the setup to that story had some significant flaws from the get-go. Most notably, it rewrote the death of Uncle Ben in the first movie, a moment that already had plenty of emotional weight. It reveals that the man Peter thought murdered his uncle wasn't the one who pulled the trigger. And Peter's subsequent attack on the guy he thought was the killer basically amounted to him assaulting some low-life thief. It doesn't undermine the impact of his uncle's death, but it does complicate the story that emerged from that fateful act. However, that's not the most egregious flaw. Spider-Man 3 tried to make Uncle Ben's real killer, Flint Sandman Marco, more complex. Hell, they tried to make him downright sympathetic. Never mind the fact that this is wholly incompatible with who Sandman is in the comics, and never mind the fact that this complicates Peter's guilt complex about him not saving his uncle, thereby complicating his entire motivations for being a superhero. It also puts Spider-Man in a no-win position, as both a hero and a protagonist. He's understandably angry at the revelation that the man who killed his uncle is still out there. But before we, the audience, can even cheer him on, we learn that Sandman isn't some cold-hearted killer. He was a thief out of desperation. He needed money for his sick daughter. That makes the idea of Spidey beating the crap out of him feel just off, not to mention unheroic. It also makes the end where Peter forgives Flint feel so empty. When Flint realizes who he is and explains what happened that night, the drama just feels so muted. The audience already knows that Flint isn't evil on the level of Norman Osborn. Now, when Peter sees it too, learning on top of that his uncle's death was just an accident, there's really no tension at play. Hell, if Peter doesn't forgive Flint, then he's not necessarily an asshole, but he's not much of a hero either. And after 3 movies of striving to be a hero, any decision other than forgiveness would have felt like a regression of the character. And for Flint, the impact of that forgiveness is incredibly limited. He just says he's really sorry, he does nothing to try and make up for it, he just apologizes, Peter forgives him, and then he disappears, vanishing into a sandy dust. That's it. He faces no other consequences for his actions. He's not completely off the hook, but his story is effectively over. It was never set up to be anything more than an emotional catalyst for Spider-Man. Now, Spider-Man 3 had various other plots, too many to balance in my opinion, but forgiveness is supposed to be hard. Here, it just felt inevitable and necessary. There was no other recourse that Spider-Man could have taken without undermining his status as a hero and a protagonist. If he did anything else, it would have completely derailed his hero's journey. Now, the details for a really good forgiveness story are still there. Confronting his uncle's killer and finding the strength to forgive him, there's a lot of genuine drama there, but the execution just doesn't work. A good forgiveness plot cannot and should not be so predictable and bland. It needs to have an impact, one that resonates for all the right reasons. Now, there's a lot to be said about Avatar: The Last Airbender and the remarkable depth of its story. There's a reason this show has such a passionate following. Between endearing characters, beautiful animation, and incredible writing, Avatar: The Last Airbender is a case study in how to tell a great story. Seriously, you could teach an entire writing class by drawing lessons from this show. Since plenty of other channels praise various aspects of this show, I'm going to focus primarily on how this show handles forgiveness, because, like Spider-Man 3, it's an important element to the overall story. And for that story to work, the forgiveness plot also has to work. It also has to have emotional weight. And that is where Prince Zuko comes in. While Aang may be the main protagonist of the show, Zuko is responsible for many of its best moments. His journey from determined antagonist to a fully redeemed ally is one of the most well-written stories you'll find in any medium. But that journey cannot be completed without forgiveness. And it's a long journey too. For the first half of the series, Zuko is a tenacious adversary for both Aang and his friends. He attacks them at every turn, trying to recapture the Avatar, and he has understandable reasons for doing so. He hopes that by doing this, he will undo his exile and restore his honor in the eyes of the Fire Nation and his father. He's already deeply scarred, both physically and emotionally. He shows early on that he's willing to cross many lines to get what he wants. But as the show unfolds, he comes to realize that this path isn't right for him. Time and again, he's racked with doubt, insecurity, and guilt. He starts to question his place within his family and his nation. And the more that we, the audience, learn about him, the more we want to root for him. Unlike Sandman, doing so doesn't undermine the journey of his character or of Aang. Eventually, Zuko does decide to join Aang, and in doing so he betrays his father, his sister, and his nation. But he makes this choice willingly. And he doesn't take it lightly either. And with respect to the forgiveness elements, that setup works perfectly. Both Aang and the audience have seen everything that Zuko has done. We've come to understand the context of his actions as well as his motivations. And even then, it's not guaranteed that he'll be forgiven. In fact, Aang and his friends, who are as heroic and good-natured as they come, have good reasons not to forgive Zuko. He's had opportunities to choose a different path before, but time and again he makes bad decisions that leave lasting scars, literally in Aang's case. The decision to forgive him is not taken lightly. It's also not just given on a whim. Zuko ends up having to earn forgiveness, and he absolutely does. In Season 3, Episode 12, The Western Air Temple, he has to stand up to an overpowered mercenary trying to hunt Aang. It's a fiery, action-packed scene, but beyond winning this battle, it reaffirms that he's not the same person he was before. He really wants to walk a new path. And when Aang ultimately forgives him, entrusting him to be his new firebending teacher in the process, there's a lot of weight to it. And unlike Spider-Man 3, that is not the end of Zuko's story, or Aang's story for that matter. Forgiving Zuko acts as a catalyst to the more dramatic events that play out in the last half of Season 3. And within those events, Zuko has even more opportunities to vindicate that forgiveness. It makes his story more compelling. It makes Aang's story more compelling. It makes the entire series a more satisfying journey overall. That's a rare feat, and one that forgiveness as a theme actually enhances. It still feels necessary to some extent, but it doesn't detract from the drama or the characters. Again, that's not easy to do. It's also even easier to mess up. Sandman's story isn't the only forgiveness plot in Spider-Man 3. What happens between Peter and Harry Osborn is every bit as personal, more so in some cases. In this instance, though, it's not Peter who's tasked with forgiving. It's Harry, a character who has suffered and lost plenty, but has also made some bad, misguided decisions. At the beginning of the movie, Harry is every bit as motivated as Prince Zuko. He blames Spider-Man for the death of his father. He's out for revenge and has plenty of understandable reasons. And Peter only ends up giving him even more when he taunts Harry after defeating him at the midpoint of the movie. Yes, Peter was corrupted by the Venom symbiote at the time. That doesn't make his words sting any less, nor does it give Harry any more reasons to forgive. It sets up a pivotal moment in which Harry has to make a choice. Does he forgive Peter and help him against Sandman and Venom, or does he just tell him off and continue hating him? On paper, it sounds like it checks all the right boxes for a good forgiveness story, but in practice, it has a few key flaws that undermine the overall impact. The first major issue is Harry's underlying motivation. We, the audience, know that Spider-Man didn't kill his father. We also know his father was a psychotic killer who hurt people, including people Harry actually cared about. But Harry doesn't know any of this. He doesn't learn until just before he makes his big decision that his father died by his own hands, whereas Zuko made his decision after an extended period of introspection and inner turmoil. Harry makes his only once he learns the truth. If he doesn't, then his entire hate-fueled revenge scheme has been rendered both meaningless and misguided. The plot essentially requires that he forgive Peter. If he doesn't, he's worse than any villain. He's just an outright asshole. That directly leads into the second issue. Harry's act of forgiveness can only ever have a limited impact. His entire story arc is built around him either not knowing what a monster his father was or not knowing the full truth. Zuko might have been an angry, angsty teenager, but he knew the kind of person his father was. He had the scar to show for it. That gave even more weight to his decision. With Harry, he could only ever make choices based on what he knew at the time. It's what makes Harry Osborn a tragic but frustrating character throughout the Raimi trilogy. His story is driven heavily by both Spider-Man and his father, but he's totally in the dark until the last act of the last movie, and as a result, his choices feel limited and so does his agency. His thirst for revenge is entirely unwarranted, and Peter knows it. The audience knows it. Everybody but Harry knows it. Even though he makes a noble sacrifice in the end, his willingness to forgive still feels hollow. It comes off as more a reaction to the truth than a difficult choice. And it's because his choice to forgive is not that difficult in light of the truth, it just doesn't carry enough dramatic weight. Spider-Man 3 had a full movie trilogy to set up a quality forgiveness arc. Avatar: The Last Airbender had 3 seasons to build up Zuko's arc. But a good forgiveness plot doesn't need multiple movies or an entire season to set it up. As great as Zuko's story is, it's not the only forgiveness story in Avatar. In fact, one of the most effective forgiveness stories you'll ever find is in a single episode, specifically Season 3, Episode 16, The Southern Raiders. The details and setup of that story are plenty dramatic. Zuko is still trying to earn the trust of Aang's team at the time, but that's a secondary concern. The real meat of the story revolves around Katara confronting the man who murdered her mother. And even though she has a big heart and is one of the most compassionate characters in the entire show, there's no guarantee she's willing to forgive anyone in this instance. There are stakes for Zuko, too. He already has one big strike against him with Katara. He betrayed her in Season 2, an act that almost got Aang killed. If she chooses not to forgive him, it's entirely understandable. But once again, Zuko makes the effort to earn that forgiveness by helping Katara find her mother's killer. It's an effort that brings out the best and worst in Katara. We see her at her most determined. She's usually the most level-headed and restrained member of the team. To see her pursue revenge so ruthlessly is genuinely jarring. Other characters rightly point this out. She doesn't go full John Wick or anything, but she does come distressingly close. And it all culminates in a moment where she confronts her mother's killer, Yon-Ra. While he's no Norman Osborn, he's no Sandman either. There's no effort to make him sympathetic. This man murdered Katara's mother in cold blood and without a shred of remorse. He doesn't even try to apologize. He's just this broken old man, now at the mercy of a very pissed off waterbender. There's no reason for Katara to forgive this man. If she ended him where he stood, everyone would understand. Some might even applaud her. You won't find an act of revenge that's more justified outside a Punisher comic. Then, in a moment of great tension and real drama, Katara makes her choice. Despite having every possible reason to strike this man down, she chooses not to. And it's never framed as an act of weakness. It comes off as an act of immense strength. It's a powerful moment, and one of the best moments in the show, in my opinion. It reaffirms Katara's strength as well as her heart. It also affirms the core of her character, demonstrating how far she's come to this point. On top of that, it leads to this beautiful moment between her and Zuko. While she can never forgive the man who murdered her mother, she can forgive Zuko. For both of them, it's both sincere and cathartic. Did I mention this whole thing played out in a single 22-minute episode? Granted, it was set up by previous episodes, but it still managed to complete a well-crafted forgiveness story with all the right dramatic elements. It shows that, as difficult as forgiveness stories can be, they can still work beautifully and still have time for commercial breaks. Spider-Man 3 and Avatar: The Last Airbender both try to tell bold stories. They each make an effort to confront the intricacies of a good forgiveness arc. They have the right settings, characters, and plots, but only Avatar really succeeds in telling that story. That's not to say Spider-Man 3 outright failed. With both Harry Osborn and Sandman, there's still plenty of action, drama, and conflict to be had. Some of it was fleshed out exceptionally well, but in terms of telling a quality forgiveness story, the final product just feels incomplete. There's just not enough there to strike all the necessary chords. It feels weak and shallow, more akin to a necessary plot point rather than a painful choice. In contrast, Avatar: The Last Airbender leaves no chord unstruck and no moment unrealized. It puts the characters in difficult, heart-wrenching situations, moments where they have to decide for themselves whether to forgive or to seek vengeance. The plot doesn't require forgiveness, but it does require that they make that choice and deal with the consequences. The end result is a testament to the power of forgiveness and the strength it takes to give it. Even if someone doesn't deserve forgiveness, it's incumbent upon the character to make that choice. It's hard enough in the real world. Many amazing stories attempt to capture that hardship. Not all succeed, but those that do are worth acknowledging, and their lessons in forgiveness are certainly worth heeding. Thanks for watching, everybody, and thanks for joining me in my world. Please be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Take care and stay safe, everyone.